October 12th is nearly upon us, and we have to talk. Not about the epic cutscene featuring a heroic and very bald Bolvar saving humanity. Not about the Ashen Verdict reputation system and the 277 item level ring I'll be trash farming week 1. No, my friends, today we need to talk about healers. More specifically, which healers are the best for Icecrown Citadel. Bring the right healers to your raid and you could be looking at an early Lich King kill and 284 item level weapons for everybody. Bring the wrong healers and you'll be stuck on normal mode Sourfang for weeks. So let's jump into the ultimate Phase 4 healer tier list. Methodology. So I've done over 40 hours of PTR and I have a really good feel for the fights. Our guild even recently killed Putricide Heroic mode, which has only been done a few dozen times so far. As I've been healing, I've noticed some really big differences between Trial of the Crusader and ICC. These differences are big enough that they change the balance among healers, and we need to talk about them before we get to the tier list. The first big difference is that almost every fight is between 4 and 6 minutes. These are long, intense fights where a lot of people take damage and need to be topped up. If you play a healer that struggles with mana in Trial of the Crusader, things are going to be a lot worse in ICC. Also, during these long fights, there are a lot of opportunities to make a small mistake and end up dead. Also, utility spells like Innervate, Battle Res, and Mana Tide matter a lot more than they did in the past. Healing in general feels a lot more difficult in ICC, and the raid feels much closer to, say, a mythic retail raid than the vanilla fights from the past few years. The second big difference is that your healer gear going into ICC will be terrible. As discussed in old interviews, the recommended minimum item level for Icecrown Heroic bosses is 251. Most guilds will be going in with gear between 240 and 250 and doing Heroic much earlier than originally designed. Not only will your DPS be lower, so you'll end up having to heal more for longer, but your tanks will be taking far more damage at the same time. This truly is the hardest raid in Wrath of the Lich King. Most guilds won't even be reaching, let alone killing Heroic Lich King for several weeks to get new upgrades like Blood Surge. A 4 set will also take about 4 weeks, which means we'll be running the same TOC gear for the first month. The third big change between TOC and ICC is that there's far more movement. Seemingly every fight has some sort of mechanic where you have to dodge a giant bouncing ball or get away from a ghost. There's no question this benefits specific healers like Disc Priest compared to classes that have to stand in place. With that out of the way, let's jump into the healer tier list. I'll be ranking healers from worst to best in the B, A, and S tiers. There aren't any C tier healers in this phase. It's a phase where every healer has a role. It's just that some healers share roles or they have bigger roles than others. Starting off the B tier, we have Holy Priest. Holy Priest has strong viability in Icecrown related to keeping the raid topped up similar to Resto Druids. For example, on the Plague Dog Trash, you can instantly top the raid up by pre-casting Prayer of Healing and then Circle of Healing. There's also the utility of getting both the mana and the Healing Hymn spells as well. Having a second copy of each in the raid is really nice, especially with the Healing Hymn buff. Guardian Spirit, though, is your real claim to fame. It's got super high relevance on fights like the Lich King or even Sourfang when things get really hectic. The problem, though, is that priests really don't do tank healing better than paladins, and they don't do raid healing better than shamans or druids. So some of the time you end up heal sniping, and you're not really 10 out of 10 in any specific aspect. Moving into the A tier, we have Resto Shamans. Resto Shamans provide completely insane raid healing on fights like Sindragosa. Plus, they arguably scale as well or better than any of the other healers. For example, their tier 10 set bonuses are excellent. The 2-piece sees Riptide giving 20% haste to your next spell cast, as well as the 4-piece giving a dot to chain heal crit targets. This isn't going to be vanilla where you can just stack multiple shamans and blast through the raid, but you can still definitely double up on fights like Sindragosa. Plus, you can always dual spec LA Shaman if you're looking to drop healers after progression is over. I'm also a huge fan of their utility like their Mana Tide, which is really clutch on long fights. I'm also a big fan of their Ancestral Spirit, which seems to get used on every fight. That's the real knock on Resto Shaman and ICC. This is a raid where you have to move every few seconds, so I see a lot of movement-related healing loss and higher shaman deaths than in other raids. Also in the A tier is a surprising newcomer, the Resto Druid. Resto Druid in Icecrown Citadel thrives for the first time all expansion. The entire raid feels like non-stop chunks of raid-wide damage, and there's really nobody better at keeping the raid topped up. On fights like Blood Queen, I was routinely healing the most, but that's not the best part. Resto Druid really thrives on the hardest fights, the fights where you need your healers to be absolutely blasting. On our Putricide Heroic kill, I felt like every heal I put out was having a huge impact. Meanwhile, on Sindragosa, the AoE healing felt completely necessary. The recent buff to Wild Growth really is noticeable here, and for the first time ever, Druid feels like an AoE healing monster. Also, we have to remember that in progression, everybody's mana starved and dying to random mechanics. Innervate is such a massive help for Disc Priest, while Battle Res might be the single best spell for progression rating. Plus, your tier 10 is a solid jump up to 15% more healing, and it really synergizes well with the new fights. The only other Resto Druid note is that they're really great for dual spec. I was dual specking on Sourfang Heroic and it felt fantastic switching between damage and healing. It also feels fantastic to subscribe and join our community. Don't miss out. Moving into the S tier, we have Disc Priest. Disc Priests have two huge advantages in Phase 4 over all the other healers. The first advantage is that the Lich King weapons finally catch up to Valanir. Since Disc was the only class without Valanir, that's a huge win. Even the 271 version of the Scepter of Terranas is absolutely insane for Disc. You also get the highest stats jump in the game by far, going from the 4-piece tier 8 to the 4-piece tier 10. The set bonus is mostly to get the free stats and the 5% power word shield increase, but it's still massive. In terms of gameplay, Disc Priest has a blast in Phase 4. Plus, your shields scale really well with spell power, and you bring big utility to the raid with your hymns. The only downside to Disc is that in the longer fights, your mana will suffer. Hopefully you'll be getting innervates though, so it's not a major problem. Rounding out the S tier is the Holy Paladin. Holy Paladins end the expansion the way they started. They're the strongest tank healers in the game. With few exceptions, if you have a Paladin assigned to a tank and they're able to cast uninterrupted, that tank won't die during the fight. Your utility is also mandatory for difficult fights like Putricide with things like Divine Sacrifice and Aura Mastery. Holy Paladin even gets better in Phase 4 with their new Tier 10 gear. Since some Paladins were even running Tier 8 before this, it's a massive increase in overall stats. The only downsides to H-Pal in this phase is that most of the fights have a lot of movement. You really can't plant and cast as much as you'd like to. Also, early on, there's so much tank damage that mana can become an issue. Soon enough, though, you'll be a dominating heal machine that nobody else can compare to. Speaking of comparison, though, you'll want to know the best damage dealers in Phase 4 as well. Check out my Phase 4 DPS tier list next.